Hello, I'm Salman Rushdie. I'm sitting in tonight for Charlie Rose. David Grossman and Gioconda Belli are here. David Grossman from Israel, Gioconda Belli from Nicaragua, both major voices within their own countries and languages and far beyond. David Grossman was born and raised in Jerusalem. He has written 6 novels, 3 works of nonfiction. His most recent book is a retelling of the story of Samson, Lion's Honey. Gioconda Belli has written all kinds of things, poetry, memoirs, the Country Under My Skin, her wonderful memoir, her most recent novel, The Scroll of Seduction. She was also very active in the Sandinista front during the Nicaragua Revolution. Both writers are here participating in the PEN American Center's second World Voices Festival of International Literature, which is taking place until April the 30th in New York City, and I'm pleased to welcome them both to this table. Welcome. Hello. And I just wanted to start by bringing up one of the kind of foundation ideas of the art of the novel, the idea of Heraclitus thousands of years ago, that a man's character is his fate, as Saul Bellow said in Augie Marsh, that character is destiny. And in a way, the whole art of the novel arises from that proposition, one might say. However, as both of you come from parts of the world in which history, external factors, are so powerful in the way in which they impact on the daily lives of human beings, that it may be not truthful in certain circumstances to say that a man's character decides his fate. Many other things may decide his fate. And the question is, when you deal with that as an artist, how does it change the way in which you have to write? I mean, how does history intrude into your novel? Obviously, you don't want to ignore the public dimension. At the same time, you don't want it to overwhelm your work. And I wondered how you dealt with that, David.
Well, it varied over the years of my writing. I think in the beginning of my career as a writer, I was much obsessed by the influence of history on me, on us as a people, as a culture. I wrote about the Shoah. I wrote a lot about the Israeli occupation. In the last years, I feel that I try to, I will not say to turn my back on reality, because this is impossible in Israel. I mean, reality there is like an acid. It eats through every protective coating one tries to enclose himself in. And I'm quite involved politically. But in the novels that I wrote in the last 10 years, I tried to regain the things that this horrible situation confiscates from us. In such a situation of violence, of constant fear, where you are really terrified, you don't know how you are going to end the day, you don't know if you will get your child that you sent to school, if you will get him back. I felt a strong need to go and to write about the things that almost have no place when war and violence roar around me. So I wrote about the most intimate things.
And it doesn't, I mean, that wouldn't strike you as escapism, for example?
No, I think it's a way to struggle with this situation. It's also a symptom of this situation, to see how one can crystallize his own intimacy and identity in such a reality that really tries to erase everything that is individual and private. And
what do you think, Gioconda, about this? So you've obviously written poetry, which is notable for its focus on love and desire and so on, but also, of course, you're an extremely political person and thinker, and I wondered how the public dimension affects your writing.
Well, I was thinking about what David said. In Nicaragua, I have felt for a long time, when I began writing novels, and my first novel was very political, that people were expecting me to write political novels. There was like a social pressure, because I think there is a need, there was a need, that's what I feel, to see themselves reflected in fiction, you know, to see that collective story, that collective struggle. There were lots of testimonial books written during that time. And, but then that has also, I felt, that people are already looking for different things, and I began to find myself, you know, mired in this kind of contradiction, whether I wanted to continue to just talk about reality or take my reality and expand it and try to find other avenues to express character more than circumstance, you know. And so that's why my last novel I went back to the 15th century Spain and took up, you know, a Spanish queen and wrote about her character, her fascinating story. Yes, Joanna. And it's very funny because in Nicaragua, people have loved the book and have thanked me for taking them out of the reality, the political reality. It's quite a contradiction. You know, you can't escape the political reality, but I think maybe we think we have a commitment to reflect it more than, or there was a time for everything, you know. Maybe the time now is a time to expand the vision.
Well, talking about expanding vision, I mean, both of you in different times have used what one might call surrealism or fabulism or magic realism. It's all the same thing to my mind in your books. I mean, in Sea Under Love, for example, the character of Bruno Schulz, the writer, doesn't meet the fate that he met in real life, but he meets a somewhat more aquatic fate that he turns into a fish and swims away. And you have in for example, in The Inhabited Woman, a woman who is possessed by a kind of demon spirit who is in some way looking for...
Angelical spirit.
Sorry, I meant supernatural spirit, let's say, in order not to make a moral choice about the spirit, but looking for a spirit in search of justice, in a way. You know? And I wondered, magic realism is often criticized for being whimsical, you know, for being an escape from truth, because anything can happen and so nothing has moral consequence. And I wondered how you react to that.
Even though I wrote this magic realism piece, I'm quite suspicious towards magic realism because sometimes I do not feel that it is absolutely committed to the real human condition. I thought when you said it, I thought that in Israel, for example, magic realism and surrealism they almost do not exist, almost. And I think that it is because the fact that for so many centuries, the Jews lived a kind of a surreal life, a magic realist life in which we lived in different places, in different diaspora. And we created for ourselves a kind of a virtual reality through books, through words, through the Talmud, through a kind of spiritual connection, through longings for Zion, for the land of Israel. When we came to Israel, we were so fascinated and infatuated by concreteness, by reality, by the building up of a nation, all the little symptoms of becoming a real people on our land. So because of that, I think there is much less patience even for surrealism.
Yeah, no time for dreams, huh?
Well, there are dreams, there are also illusions, of course, but they are more real, they are more down to earth.
So why did Bruno Schulz turn into a fish?
Because he had no other choice, and because I wrote a book that I tried to show 4 different styles, literary styles, that will fail eventually when trying to describe the Shoah, to cope literarily with the Shoah. One of them was this magic realism, and for me, it's a salmon fish. And there is something very Jewish about the salmon. You know, they are born in a certain place, they go to the saltwater sea. Suddenly they get this pulse in their brain and they turn, the whole shoal turn, millions and millions of fishes, and they jump against the falls, and they are, it's like, you know, it's like a journey incarnated. It's like the cycle of life of a people.
It's so interesting. I remember Bernard Malamud's famous story, the Jewfish, the Jew bird, the Jew bird, and now you've invented a Jewfish.
We evolve.
But Latin America, of course, in a way, is the birthplace of magic realism, and there many writers have said that it actually describes the real world. You know, that the emphasis, so to speak, is not on the magic but on the realism.
Yeah, because, well, Garcia Marquez said it perfectly. He said that we had not found the means to make our believable, our reality, and that that was the reason of our solitude. Mm-hmm. And I think, yes, in Nicaragua, in Latin America, things happen that are of the world of magical realism. For example, William Walker in Nicaragua in the 1800s, a guy who was a U.S. citizen who became president, named himself president, decreed slavery, and made English the official language of the country. I mean, so many things
yes. I mean, I remember
in that vein.
To come then to something, the concreteness of politics. You are working now again in Nicaragua directly in politics. I mean, after your revolutionary past and then a more quietist middle period, let's say, you're now directly involved again. And why is that you felt the need to do that?
I think because what I lived...
And say something about what you're doing.
Well, I am working in an electoral campaign. We are having elections in November of 2006. And so far, 2 big parties are running. And we are trying to have 2 other parties join the race so that we can have more diversification in our democracy, because it's becoming this kind of bipartisan thing, and the 2 parties are allied, so they are controlling everything, and it's a very bad situation for our democracy. So to have other people running is very important. So I am helping one of the candidates who is running
Who is
in
that?
the communication campaign. His name is Herty Levites. And,
We are for him immediately.
Huh?
We are for him. I don't know what he said. I'm for him.
Well, he's Jewish. His father was Jewish,
Even though
and
I'm
his
for him.
story, his story is almost like a magical realism story. That the father was in New York, he was very lonely, and he spinned a globe and put his finger in Nicaragua, and that's where he went.
All right.
And so Herty I am working with him. And for me, going back to the fray, in a way, one is like in search of that identity one had. I don't know if I'm going to find it, because of course I am a different person, but there is a kind of energy that I think is very nourishing for the soul. And I've always thought that the first thing a writer needs to write is to live.
Yes.
That if your life is a life that is empty, although maybe I'm wrong, but at least that's my interpretation.
Given that this is a very different moment in Nicaragua, and here is Senor Levites, who, as David says, we now all must support. Do you think anything beneficial remains of the Sandinista revolution, or has it just disintegrated into its different component parts, with the Ortega brothers representing a kind of fist version of the revolution, and everybody else dissipated into other fields? And is there any result? Was it for nothing?
No, absolutely not. I think, 3 things. We have a professional army. Before we had the army of the regime. That's very important in Latin America, especially. Professional and apolitical. And we have a sort of democracy. I mean, at least we have the basis. And people have a different mentality now. People have a sense of their own rights that they didn't have before. The servile mentality that they had during the dictatorship has disappeared.
So it's not a banana republic.
It's not a banana republic. It doesn't have the soul of a banana republic. And just for that, I think the revolution was worth it.
Well, that's it. Now, David, I know I read somewhere you saying that because you've often eloquently spoken sympathetically about the political attitude, the political realities of the Palestinian people, that has made you feel or be treated in a way as as being marginalized in the conversation in Israel. Do you think that's true? Or do you think it matters?
First of all, it doesn't matter. I think we all here probably will agree that writer should be a kind of a built-in outsider. And then, of course, coming from my tradition, the Jewish tradition, this was always the place of the writer and the intellectual. It's a tricky situation because I don't feel that my literature has been marginalized in Israel. If you ask about my political opinions, well, I can tell you that the new Prime Minister and also Ariel Sharon are advocating very firmly and decisively things that people like Amos Oz or myself or many other people of the left advocated 20 and 25 years ago. So maybe it's not really being marginalized, but in a strange way, our opinions was received. It's not as we want it to be still. And always, I mean, when people ask, well, now are you content? You know, we are going to withdraw from part of the territories. And I said, no, I think we have to withdraw from all territories if we really want to have a viable peace and if we really want to have good relationship with our neighbors. Now, there is another problem, and this is our neighbors. Because Israel, as I feel, started to mature in the last half year. After Ariel Sharon made it legitimate for the Israelis to accept the principle of withdrawing from the occupation and allow them to feel how much they really wanted it, how much it is such a burden on them, how much the settlers who were the beloved child of the new Zionism, how they turned to be the black sheep of the family. But suddenly, the Palestinians who totally misread the Israeli text, as it often happened to both peoples, they suspect each other so much that every step of the other is regarded as a trick, as a manipulation. And they chose the Hamas. Now, what will be with the Hamas, it's hard to predict.
Well, it'd be interesting to know what you think. There's some Israeli opinion which says it's a good thing that Hamas came to power because it will, if you like, civilize them, force them to accept reality.
Well, and it can be good because it's only the Hamas with whom we can strike a reasonable deal, because the previous leadership did not represent the Palestinian people and was regarded as a corrupt regime. If the Hamas remains Hamas, we have no one to deal with, because if the Hamas continues to not recognize Israel, to not to respect previous agreements, to support terrorism, then with all the goodwill, we have nobody to talk to. Nevertheless, there are two possibilities. Either the Hamas would be willing to strike a kind of a practical deal with us, a kind of a ceasefire for 10 years. This is good. Ceasefire is better than a fire. But it's not what we really wanted. We want to have a peace that would be really inherent in the hearts of the people, that both sides would internalize the idea that you cannot exterminate the other, not a ceasefire that will be only a cover-up for accumulating more and more weapons and more aspirations about eradicating the other.
To end the question of whether Israel is going to be there or not.
That's the only question you have, whether Israel is going to be there or not.
No, I'm saying that's the question to bring to an end.
Yeah.
Do you think that the American, what feels like almost unconditional support of Israel, is necessary, counterproductive? How do you feel the relationship between America and Israel?
First of all, I'm glad to have America as an ally. It's good, especially when you are such a small country in the Middle East, which is not the most friendly neighborhood, especially to us. Yet, you know, whenever an Israeli prime minister comes back from America and he says, we have a great friend in the White House, I think to myself, maybe it would be better to have a lesser great friend in the White House, or let's say a real friend, because a real friend should come and tell you, listen, you are living in illusions. You cannot continue to dictate the agenda of the Middle East forever. You must make a very painful compromise. This is, by the way, what I hope that will happen now, that the new Israeli elected prime minister would come and challenge the Palestinians with a very daring peace plan. And then let's see if the Palestinian people willing to continue to be hostages of the fundamentalism of the Hamas, or they are willing to accept such a proposal. Let's hope.
And what would be the sensitive or clever or subtle response that you would want from the United States? I mean, how can America help that?
First of all, to start to mediate between us and the Palestinians, America is doing next to nothing. I mean, it's outrageous to see how America continues to finance our megalomanic hallucinations there and really do nothing in order to solve this problem. It's really immoral the way President Bush ignores the situation there, because the United States is the only power that is able to bring us together and to force us to look at each other's eyes and to do something. Without them, we cannot do it.
So America should talk to Hamas?
America should talk to Hamas, yes. Yeah.
Well, that's, and now, you, Gioconda, you've been very much on both sides of the relationship with the United States. You know, I mean, you were a member of a revolution against a United States shored-up regime.
And then I married the enemy.
And then you married an American, and you ended up in Los Angeles,
yes,
which is an extraordinary fate. And now, No, I mean, an excellent and sweet fate in some ways, but bittersweet perhaps.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering now, what is the activity of America in Nicaragua now? And is it once again something that needs a kind of resistance or not?
Well, it's the lack of recognition. I think it's a little bit what happens everywhere with the United States. I think there is a very short-term vision of processes, of political processes in countries. And they want to control whatever is happening in Nicaragua. They are deadly afraid that Daniel Ortega might win again. And so they are intervening so much to unite the supposedly democratic forces, which is everybody who is not in the left. And so they are giving Daniel Ortega ammunition to say, I am the man who represents the dignity of the country. I am the only one who is independent of all these powers. And so it's a very counterproductive kind of action that they are having in Nicaragua. And I think it's also the same case in Latin America. I think it's been like that, and it continues to be, and it's a lack of thinking that we can know what we are doing, that we can have the wherewithal to handle our own problems and and be respectful, and that is constantly, I think, a lack of tact, very open, because the inference of the ambassador is not like a discreet calling of somebody and talking. It's open. He goes and he invited all the political parties of the right that he would finance the primaries. So that they would elect a one candidate.
The American
so it's
embassy
ridiculous,
is,
no?
The American embassy is this big palace on the hill.
And they are making a huge building.
But what is happening across Latin America, or has been happening in the last few years, is a return of governments of the left,
Yes.
across the spectrum. And in some way, people say this is because the United States kind of dropped the ball in South America, because they had their eye so much on the security issue, and Islamic terrorism and the war on terror, so-called.
No, I think it has to do with neoliberalism. I think it has to do with the Washington Consensus began this whole policy that of privatization of public utilities, and trying to balance the macroeconomic factors in every country in Latin America, and they cut a lot of social programs, and the neoliberal recipe didn't work. I mean, when they were buying all these companies, the utility companies and all that, there was a lot of corruption that came out of there. And the neoliberal, the fact that the state was weakened, so people who are the majority in Latin America, who are disenfranchised, and we need a strong state in Latin America. And so the state, when it was weakened, the people felt completely left out. And so it was not a successful, obviously, and it was not a successful policy, because people began to feel really disenfranchised, began to lose faith in the established political parties, and began to look for other alternatives.
So now, we have to wrap up a little bit, but what do you think, if your guy, Mr. Senor Levites, comes to power, what would be his likely stance towards the United States?
I think, these governments of the left in Latin America, we want, the idea is to have good relations with the United States, respectful relations. And, we understand that the United States has an interest in the region, and there is trade interest and all that. But, if we want to be able to have our own decisions, not to have so much, not to have them say so much about what we do. But I don't think it's a confrontation.
Do you feel like America's backyard?
I don't.
No. And David, just to give you the last word, the subject of the wall and the building of the barrier.
I'm amazed you're asking me political questions all
I'm
the
asking
time.
you, all right,
Salman,
all right,
we have
all right.
three writers
Okay,
here.
all right,
Why should we talk politics all the
let's
time?
talk about, all right, let's leave that because we've talked a lot about that. But let's talk instead about what you were saying earlier, the need to recover a private space inside this war zone. And I'm just wondering how much that is possible. I mean, do you feel in a world where the clamor is so intense that you can truthfully tell the story of a human life without regard to that?
I do not ignore reality around me, but there are so many things that that are marginalized because of this situation. And telling a story, first of all, for me as a writer, it gives me a place in this chaotic reality where I constantly feel in a kind of an exile from significance, from the language, because the language is so heavily manipulated to buffer between us and reality, not to discover reality for us. Because I live in a reality that so much of the stuff that affects my life and infects my life is irrelevant for me. It is imposed on me by people who are irrelevant, by events that are irrelevant. And when I write my stories, I deal with a language that is mine. I do not surrender to the cliches of the media, of the government, of the army. I think, every writer is someone who feels claustrophobic in words that other people used and overused. I have the right, the privilege to use my own language in this polluted political situation. I have the privilege to deal with materials that are relevant to my life as a human being, not only as an Israeli.
Did you find when you used the form of the children's story, because you've had great success with that, I mean, for instance, when you wrote Zigzag Kid, when you wrote Someone to Run With, which are books which had, as they say, a great crossover success also into the adult world, did you find that form, the children's story, the fable, was a release in some way?
First of all, I enjoyed writing from point of view of children because I think I have a kind of a free access to this age, and I'm fascinated by this phase of us in life. I think being a child is a very fragile age in our life. It is, you are all the time in a constant effort to decode the world, to decode the language, the relationship in the family, the right things to do or not to do, to understand your body, all this. So when I write from a point of view of a child, I think I get a very fresh look at things that are a little worn out for me at my age. And when you write from a point of view of a child, of a youngster, there is this pleasure of exploring this idealism that unfortunately is fading out at our age when we become rotten with sobriety. We can enjoy this enthusiasm of discovering the world anew, being idealistic again.
Well, it's obviously had a great impact in Israel because of the colossal success with adults as well of this book. I'm going to give you the last word, Gioconda, because you started as a poet, a very famous poet. You won Everything in Sight, Casa de las Americas Prize, etc. Then you've moved into all these other forms, the memoir, the novel. Do you feel still a poet? Do you feel poetry is still something that you can express yourself through?
Yes, I keep writing poetry. Well, I think there is a very profound instinct that I have to express myself as a woman. And that I think in all these forms that I have tried, it's because I want to express all the different aspects of a woman's life, and the sensuality, for example, which has been one of the things that I have worked a lot in my writing, the erotism, because I think one of the things that has trapped us women is not being able to celebrate who we are, to celebrate our femininity, and to kind of take away the guilt and all that. And so that is a constant way that I have tried to make my women characters, to make them strong, to make them joyful, to make them women who are in the world in many ways, who even if they are in a war, they are still women, they are still sexy, they are still enjoying and loving and having all this, an integral experience as a human being. Yeah. And as a writer, I want to have that integral experience of using all different kinds of forms too.
Well, it's fantastic because both of you are really talking about retaining the human dimension in what can often be an inhuman world, and I think that's a good place to end it. So, Gioconda, David, thank you both very much.
Salman.
Thank you, Salman.